Welcome back to Bright Brains, where we dive into the most compelling topics of our time with fascinating individuals from around the world. Today, I have a special guest joining us. His name is AJ Porter. AJ is a Canadian citizen with a keen interest in U.S. politics, and he's here to share his unique perspective on the upcoming presidential election. I'm excited to hear his thoughts and explore how this election might influence not only the U.S., but the world at large. Alexander, thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, excited to talk about everything politics.
Awesome. Me too, man. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, you did. That was a good intro. I live in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And in terms of what I do professionally, like I've worked in the nonprofit sector for a while and the social services as well. So I have some experience working for a few years. I worked in the homeless shelter system here in Toronto. So definitely have a lot of insight into, topics related to homelessness or the opioid epidemic and all of that sort of thing. And yeah, I've just had a keen interest in politics, specifically US politics. I mean, I probably know more about the US politics than even Canadian politics at this point, just probably more interesting. But yeah, so I've just kind of for many years now been just following closely and I consider myself to be, well informed on a lot of topics. So always looking to have good conversations with folks here in Canada, but also if folks from the US to kind of get your perspective too. It's so interesting when I hear from someone who's currently in the US who will be most impacted probably by this upcoming election to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, most definitely. So let's hop into it. How is US politics portrayed in Canadian media?
Um, I would say it's probably, I mean, we cover a lot of US politics here in Canada. So on election night, so in November, all of our local channels will probably be covering the election. Um, and it's portrayed, very similarly. I mean, you have kind of both perspectives or both sides. You have people who are probably um, pro-Trump and then pro-Democrats or progressive. So you kind of have both of those perspectives in the media, and we do follow it very closely, which I guess is probably why I can say I'm probably know more about the US politics and what's been going on than Canadian because most of our media follows it quite closely too. Obviously, when in Canada, if we have an election or obviously there's an important political event, we'll follow that pretty closely. But the rest of the time, it's pretty much like what's going on in the US. What's the newest thing that's happening? So it's portrayed probably pretty similarly, like we follow pretty closely.
That's interesting. So you say they follow the US politics more than Canadian politics. How does that make you feel? And how do other Canadians feel about that?
Um, yeah, well, I can't really speak for other Canadians, but I know for me, um, I think it just kind of comes with the territory. I mean, the US elections and US politics is hugely influential, not only in the US, but abroad. And because we're, your northern neighbors, it does heavily impact us too. So I think yeah, I mean, I guess I could say I would like there to be more coverage about Canadian politics in general. Um, we do have probably like a Canadian equivalent to what would be like a CNN. But like you're always going to tune into CNN over that because it's just like, I mean, I gotta say your politics are more interesting than ours 90% of the time. Um, and it's probably not a good thing just because of how
Yeah.
wild it's been the last couple of years. So I wouldn't say that's a good thing, but um, yeah. So in terms of how I feel about it, I think it just comes with the territory. I mean, your politics is hugely influential, and while our politics and our elections will impact us, but I think the US will have broader impact internationally. So I think that's why everyone's kind of looking at it so closely.
this year alone, 2024, has been pretty wild. So, things that have happened. One, Donald Trump almost got assassinated, which is crazy because that was pretty
Wild.
much, I feel like it happened and then people pretty much forgot about it instantly. Like nobody really cared anymore. Biden and Trump had that disastrous debate, and then people finally had to stop. People had to finally admit that Biden was mentally deteriorating. So let's jump into those two things right there. Let's talk about that debate. How do people in Canada see Joe Biden?
Um, Again, I think like the US, I think we're probably you'd find that in Canada people are pretty divided on that too. You definitely have your right-wing Trump supporters here in Canada who are very conservative, and then you have your more progressive or your left of center. So in terms of how they felt about Joe Biden, I think, or at least the people I know in my life or people I talk to regularly, I mean, we all weren't fans of Biden. Like I didn't love him as a president, but he was definitely the better choice between him and Donald Trump. So I was before he dropped out, you know, I was like, well, it's two terrible options, but let's pick the better one here. And then
Mhm.
after seeing the debate, it was, like I said, disastrous. But what is interesting, and this isn't my quote. I was I can't remember where I saw it, but the election or the debate was so bad for Biden that it actually ended up being pretty bad for Trump because it led to Biden leaving the race, which was, I'm sure Trump did not want that or anyone
Yeah.
on his side of the aisle. So yes, it was really bad for Trump or really bad for Biden, but I think you could argue that it ended up worse for Trump if Kamala ends up going on to win. So I guess in terms of Joe Biden, yeah, like he was seen as the lesser of two evils, but still not great by any means.
Yeah, man. I think you're right about how this debate kind of bit Trump in the back because, yeah, he beat Biden in that debate, but people finally had to admit that Biden was gone. He needs to be in a senior citizen home or something like that. Yeah. And now we got Kamala in here, but we'll get to that. But I want to ask you, when Trump won the election in 2016, what was the reaction like in Canada?
Shock. 100%. I speaking mostly, of course, for myself again, totally shocked, disappointed, upset, and I think maybe we were even more shocked here in Canada. I mean, I know a lot of people in the US were shocked, but maybe you know, when you're in it, like if you live in the States, you probably, depending on where you live, you probably have people in your life or maybe your neighbors who did support Trump or whatever. So maybe you could see it coming a little bit more. But here in Canada, we're going with like what the media is showing or whatever, and never an indication that Trump was going to win. It was always, he has no chance, no path to winning, and then all of a sudden he did. So yeah, completely shocked and took me a long time to kind of come to the reality of the situation. That's for sure.
Yeah. So I'm not a Trump supporter, but I knew that he was going to win as soon as he came on the scene. Just the things that he was saying and the amount of publicity behind him. I think they said something like in the media for Trump would get the equivalent of hours of promotion, like free promotion by CNN and Fox, whereas only Hillary Clinton in comparison would get minutes of promotion. And, I live in Ohio, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that state, but it's like a conservative state in the Midwest. And I would see Trump flags and Trump bumper stickers everywhere. And what's interesting is, I would tell people, I'm like, hey, I think he's going to win. And everybody was like, no, ain't no way. There's no way he's going to win, you know. But it happened. And yeah, everybody here was shocked. And I'm like, I don't understand why you guys are shocked. Pay attention. This whole country is pretty much a conservative country. The major cities are what's liberal. And then to make it even worse, we have this thing called the Electoral College. I don't know, you're probably familiar with that. So even though a person like Hillary can win the popular vote, they can still lose to Trump because of Electoral College. So yeah, it's pretty wild. But 2020 came along, that pandemic, and I think that's the only thing that really got Biden into office. People wanted someone who seemed more mature, more responsible. But 2024, pandemic has passed. What's going to happen? I don't know. What do you think is going to happen in 2024? Who do you think is going to win, or who do you want to win?
Um, well, who do I want to win? I want
Yeah,
Kamala Harris.
yeah,
She would be my choice if I was American. I would vote for her. In terms of who I think will win, it's really a 50-50 toss-up for me, which I don't like
yeah,
saying. It's kind of a little too close for comfort. Um, but I'm going to choose to be on the optimistic side and say that I think Kamala will win, but it will be very close. It'll be a very narrow margin, which is the sad thing to say. I think after we've seen all of the stuff that Trump has done and will continue to do, it's kind of sad that he can even stand that close of a chance to getting in again. But that's, I guess, like you said, still a very conservative country. Um, and I mean, we see that in, you know, various policies that certain states enact. And I think and I think the Canada's perception of the US, it's like we see US as that very conservative, a lot of like policies that make it feel like it's like the 1800s again, or like it's going backwards in time. So I think that's kind of the conservative undertones that aren't even really undertones. Their conservative voice is really loud, and that's what I think we see in the US, like a lot of conservative people who want Trump back in. So, but I do have hope now that Kamala is the nominee. I have more hope than I did in Biden. So,
yeah. Same here. I think Kamala has invigorated the support of the left and of Democrats. But the thing is, though, was when it comes to the way the media portrays things, it can be very confusing because the thing that we have now, and I'm not sure if it's like this in Canada, maybe it is, but the media is so segregated, right? So if you want, you can just pick media that confirms your viewpoints, right? So if you're conservative, you watch Fox News, you watch other conservative media. There are influencers and YouTubers and news media outlets, newspapers that are conservative, and vice versa. If you're a liberal, you watch CNN and consume all liberal content. And the thing is that because the way this is, if you watch CNN or any of the liberal content, they're going to say, oh, Kamala is winning. Kamala is going to beat Trump. But if you listen to the conservative media, they're going to say the exact opposite. So, I'll turn to CNN, they'll say, oh, Kamala's in the lead. I turn to Fox, they say Trump is in the lead. Who's right? Who's wrong? I feel like both media outlets are gaslighting people, and it's hard to really understand and get a judgment of what you think is going on. So, as an outsider, well, first, let me ask you this: is it the same way in Canada, where you have this sort of culture war going on between the right and the left, and it's hard to really understand what's happening in politics?
um, yeah, that's a good question. I think it's definitely not to the same extent as the US. I mean, we do have access to CNN. Like I watch CNN regularly. So we do get like those channels here in Canada. We also get Fox News. Um, but in terms of media outlets that are strictly Canadian, like we have the CBC, which is like the main Canadian broadcasting network, which I guess would be equal to probably like a ABC or an NBC or something like that. So they're the main ones, and like a lot of people get their information from them. And they're like news broadcasting, like 24-hour news cycle kind of content. I mean, I guess not 24 hours. They have like scripted programming and stuff, so it's not just news, but they're like the major source for news. And then you have your like Toronto Star, which is like a huge news outlet, obviously based in Toronto, but still a pretty big one across the country. And then you have like National Post, which is I think a little bit more of the conservative leaning um newspaper. It's not really a newspaper, but an online site. So we do have it, and we obviously have a lot of like, I'm sure you could go on and find like YouTube shows that are Canadian that's conservative and ones that are progressive. So we definitely have that, but not to the same extent at all. I think if you watch CBC, you're probably still getting a biased picture because it's going to be biased and they're probably more liberal leaning. Um, but yeah, definitely not like Fox News, I think is I don't want to say uniquely American because maybe other countries have something very similar, but it kind of fascinates me that you'll have a whole
Yeah.
entire network um for Trump propaganda. And I mean, I guess the right would probably say that CNN is propaganda for the left. So the
Exactly. Yeah.
divisiveness continues, but I just think like Fox News has like so many examples of after example of like just strict disinformation.
Yeah,
Like,
Fox News is almost like a caricature. It's like a cartoon almost, you know. You probably better off just watching Cartoon Network or something, it's so over the top. But
yeah.
what are some ways in which US policy affects Canada? And is it stressful knowing how, American foreign policy affects Canada and the world and knowing that you don't have a say in it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is stressful. I think, like I said before, the US is so powerful and so influential in the world. So the results of the election will definitely impact everyone, not just Canada. But because your northern neighbors, we're so close. I mean, there are certain policies, like obviously, like trade policies, or like, I remember when Trump was president, like tariffs and stuff. So we did see price increases on like certain like items at the grocery store go quite high because of when Trump was in office. I remember like that being in the news of like there was these tariffs on particular items. And so that impacted not like in a huge way. I would say most of the impact is going to be um like on foreign policy, like we'll see with like all the stuff in Israel and Gaza and international relations like with Russia and North Korea and all, so like foreign policy stuff I can see huge impact. In terms of Canada, I mean, there will be impacts, I'm sure. Just you want a president in the US who is I don't know, like I don't want to feel like every day when Trump was president, I was like, okay, what is he going to say today? What is he going to do today? Like, who knows what he's going to say? I think he did attack like Justin Trudeau a couple times or whatever. But it's like you just want someone who's not as volatile, who you don't have to like fear, like what's crazy like thing is he going to do next? Um, so if he did win, again, that would be my fear of like just going through the day to day of like, oh God, what crazy thing is he going to say next? Is he going to what's he going to say about Canada? Or what's he going to do? I don't know. Just, yeah.
Yeah, it can be very stressful. Yeah, that is one thing, about Biden. We didn't have to worry about him getting on Twitter and, starting World War III or something like that. Although, interestingly enough, Trump didn't start any new wars. That's the interesting thing. But as soon as Biden gets in office, we have Ukraine and Russia and Gaza and Palestine, you know. And one thing about this whole Gaza and Palestine thing is both parties in the US have, aren't really doing anything. They both are in favor of sending more money and weapons to Israel. What's your whole stance on that?
Yeah. So in terms of Israel and Gaza, like I'm not I obviously I try to keep up with what's happening, but I wouldn't say I'm a aficionado in like the history and the complex relations between Israel and Gaza. So definitely
Same
um
here.
try I can only speak to what I know of, and it is like kind of a limited thing. So I don't want to misrepresent anything. But I think going back to what you said about Trump, we didn't have any new wars, which is like that is true, but I don't know if necessarily it was because of Trump being in there that we didn't. I think, I mean, maybe you could argue that was, I don't know, Putin just waiting for Trump to get out of office before he could attack Ukraine. I mean, I don't know that the timing of that was interesting. Like it happened, what, like a year after Trump left. So, in terms of Israel and Gaza, I mean, I don't think Biden or Trump are very, and they're both pro-Israel. Um, and that's why we've seen at the DNC, like there's been those protesters at the DNC, the pro-Palestinian protesters who obviously are against, um, we're not against Biden, but they were challenging Biden and Kamala because of their stance. And again, I don't know, like it's really hard because yeah, like I can't, I'm trying to. I don't want to say I'm not like pro-Israel, but I'm not anti-Israel. I believe like a ceasefire is the solution. I don't know if it's a one-state solution or two-state solution, but obviously I think you can look at what's happening in Gaza and like it is a genocide of innocent civilians who are dying day to day, and that's obviously something that can't. Um, and I think Netanyahu is committing war crimes, in my opinion. So I think my stance is like I can be critical or we can be critical of Netanyahu and his response and his like particular policies, but still understand that Israel has a right to defend itself or to exist, right? So it's like a
Yeah,
tricky balancing act. So I am, and because I'm not like super in the weeds about all of the details, it's hard for me to say. I don't want to misspeak about anything, but yeah, that's how I stand. It's like I think Netanyahu is committing war crimes. Yes, he can respond and he can defend himself and Israel, but he's also, there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are being murdered every day or who have been murdered since October 7th and are continuing to be. So, you can't really defend that either. So I don't know. It's a total mess. But I
yeah.
guess my answer is I don't know if Kamala is going to be any better on that issue than Biden was, or than Trump is. So, and I don't think it's true that Trump said, like, I think, didn't he say, like, oh, if the war would be over, if I get elected, the war will be over, like, really, really shortly. And obviously, I don't think that's true. I don't think
Yeah.
it's too complex for one person to go in there and solve unilaterally. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on it, I guess?
I'm Ike.
And I'm Verum, and we're the hosts of the new podcast, Odd Brains, premiering September 1st on Patreon.
Join us now for early access to exclusive content that will otherwise not be available until our official YouTube launch later this year.
Decriminalized is the first installment of the Odd Brains series. Join us as we chat with an EMS from Portland and San Francisco, Colton Perry of the podcast Just Dumb Enough. Okay.
Check it out on Patreon, dropping September 1st, and stay tuned for further updates about additional episodes and other projects to come. You can support the Vagabond Initiative by joining our Patreon and spreading the word. Also, check out www.badproduct.co with coupon code VAGABARD. That's VAGABARD for 10% off. We appreciate any engagement whatsoever, and all proceeds will be used to reinvest into the brand. The link is in the bio below.
I wanted to ask you.
So here's my thoughts. I agree, of course, Israel has the right to defend itself, but I feel like how far is too far? And I think they've kind of passed that line. Like let's say you're out and about and a guy tries to attack you, right? And you fight him off, you beat him up, but then while he's on the ground, you like start kicking him and then like maybe start stabbing him and maybe like pick up a rock and start bashing him in the head. After that, it's kind of like, hey, man, you kind of taking it too far. I think it's kind of like that. And some of the images, what I'm seeing on social media of what's happening there, especially to like the kids and things like that, it's wild. And the mainstream media just wants us to ignore it, you know? And what my thing about this is that it's going to hurt Kamala way more than it's going to hurt Trump because I think Trump supporters they don't really care. They're fervently pro-Israel, but the left-wing supporters are more. It's not that they support Gaza; they're just anti-innocent people dying. And so I think you hear a lot of people here saying that they're not going to vote for Kamala, and I'm kind of on that fence as well if she's not going to do anything about it, then why should I vote for her? Maybe I should vote third party. And I think that there are a lot more people on the left who think that way. And this could be an issue that could cause her to lose. What do you think about voting third party? And Some people say it's a waste. Other people say, they can't support this two-party duopoly. What do you think about that?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I would probably tend to say, any or I said it in 2016, I was saying it too, of like any vote that wasn't for Hillary or wasn't yeah, wasn't for Hillary was a vote for Trump. So even if you voted third party, I still felt that that was enabling Trump to win because you're not that was just my stance because it's like because it was so close and I was like I feel like you have to look at the both options and if you're not going to actively I don't know. So I guess in going to 2024, I will say that I do believe similarly that if you really um I think if you vote for a third party or you vote independent, I would say it's more like yeah, you didn't vote for Trump, you didn't support it, but in a way you are complicit if he does win. You could have voted for Kamala, especially in those swing state that are super, super critical. I think that was a chance where you had a chance. That was an opportunity where you had the chance to have I don't know to make your choice. And I think that by just like choosing the independent who you know is not going to win, it's more so like, well, I'm gonna just like vote because I am voting, but I'm gonna kind of wash my hands of it and let the others decide is my thing rather than like sticking your. But I also can say that if people who are really have specific policies that they're interested in and that they're passionate about if they don't believe that Kamala is going to further that. But also I have to question, I mean, what policy? I don't know. Trump's also not going to further your policies. I don't know. If you're not a MAGA like right-wing MAGA supporter and you're kind of like on the fence and you're not going to vote for Kamala because of certain policies, it's like you just have to ask yourself, well, what is Trump getting in? How does that further your cause or the policy that you care about as well? So I don't know. And that's how I sort of see it. It's like you kind of have to pick one or the other. Because in Canada, we do have a similar thing where we have like the two-party system, but our third party is a little bit more formidable in terms of they've never won a federal election, but there have been like um, many provinces in Canada where this third party has won the provincial election. So the provincial government will be run by that third party. Um, so it is a little bit more, it's obviously different, but there have been cases in recent federal elections here in Canada where you know, I don't like the liberal candidate. I hate the conservative candidate. So it's like, am I going to choose this third party? And the way that we do it is a little bit different too, in terms of like how we vote and like how it how the winner gets decided or whatever. So it's a little different, but I will say this is just a long way of saying I do believe that if you vote independent, any vote that's not for Kamala is a vote for Trump. But I would love to hear your opinion
Yeah,
on that.
so, everything you just said is kind of how I feel. The thing is, though, is that I feel like the elections here, being a left-wing person, you're always sort of voting in fear and not for something. So every presidential election, they're always like, "Oh, this is the most important election of our time." If the right wing gets in there, they're gonna bring back slavery. They're going to get rid of gay marriage. They're going to make women go back to the kitchen. And it's always like doom and gloom. And so people vote out of that doom and gloom, and then the left gets in, but they don't really push anything to the left. I think so we have two parties here, but in actuality, it's kind of just one party pretending to be two different parties, you know? And so the left, I feel they're just as conservative. For example, like we mentioned about Israel and Gaza, Obama, when he was in office, he dropped a bomb in the Middle East every 20 minutes, and there are things that people want, like, say, free college, student loans forgiveness, universal health care, which is something that you guys in Canada have, but the left gets in and they don't really try to advocate and accomplish these things. Whereas, like, for an example, I just had an example. Oh, okay. So one of them is a woman's right to choose. They had many times when the left was in power to enshrine that in law, but every time they had the opportunity, they didn't do it. And so it's kind of like I know I feel, and a lot of left wing people feel, why? What are we voting for you for? You know. And another thing too is that when the left isn't in power, they are able to fundraise and make more money when the right is in power. So it's kind of advantageous for them to lose, you know. But because we're always voting out of fear, this country is just kind of trending more and more rightward, you know. I feel like the left kind of has to make concessions to try and get the people to vote, conservative people to vote for them, because this is a conservative country. And, you know, we don't really have a left wing party, you know. And when I look at Kamala, you know, like for example, one thing we've been talking about here in this country is police brutality and the criminal justice system, right? Kamala, she was a former DA. She was not a progressive DA, and she kind of represents everything that was wrong with our criminal justice system. She was locking people up. She kind of represented the war on drugs. And now that she's, you know, we talked about this for decades, you know, and now that the boogeyman Trump is back again, they want us to vote for Kamala. And now they're not talking about this kind of stuff. And it's like they just kind of pushed it onto the rug, you know. And so I guess that's what I'm saying is it feels like if voting for Democrats is useless, maybe I might as well vote my conscience, especially if they're going to keep on dropping bombs on Gazans. I mean, vote my conscience and vote third party, you know. I wish we had a system kind of like you guys in Canada. I think you guys have multiple political parties, right? Not just two.
Yeah, we have multiple. There's only ever been like, yeah, it's definitely more than the US, but like I said, we
Mm-hmm.
do have that third party that's a little bit more formidable, who's won like on the provincial level, but never federally. And we do have several other, like we have like five or six like major official parties, but really only two that ever win a federal election or like have tons and tons of support. The others are mostly like small movements that can gain momentum over time. And who knows, maybe we'll see one of them win federally. But um, yeah, so I would say like still very much dominated by the two main political parties for sure. But we still do have a little bit more outs, I would say, and more parties. So
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Kamala? I don't know if you already said that, but what are
um yeah, I mean all the stuff that you said, I agree with. I mean, that was my biggest problem with her as well was, I mean, she does have a track record as DA that isn't a great one. If you care about, she had tons of arrests and incarcerations of people while she was a DA, and that's just a fact. So I think like that was my biggest thing about her when in 2020 when she was running in the primary that I was against Kamala for was I didn't like that track record. Mind you, I didn't like, but I wasn't a big fan of Biden either, but whatever. So in terms of Kamala, yeah, like I think, I mean, she's gonna have to. That's gonna be something she's gonna have to overcome if she wants to win. Maybe. I mean, there's probably a lot of people that are going to vote for her because she's the Democratic nominee and they're just anti-Trump, which is fair, but that is something that she's going to have to either answer for. I know it's going to come up in the debate. That's why I'm kind of this debate between her and Trump in September. That's going to be a big thing he's going to, I'm sure, bring up because that is one of her weaker spots. And she has to be able to justify it in a way that makes sense and sits well with people to feel okay with voting for her. So that will be an issue, I think, for her. Um, but I also don't know how I mean, like when you compare her, it's like, yeah, that's not a great track record. But I mean, what has Trump ever done for the war on drugs? He had 4 years as president. What did he do to combat that in a real, in a real way, not just like what he can say or lie about or whatever. But I mean, he was in for 4 years and did the problem get better? No, I don't think so.
so when he did do some things, they did pass some criminal justice reforms when he was in office, and he also pardoned people who had cases that were egregious and helped them get out. One thing too about Kamala is, so in the state of California, they always have these forest fires, right? And they use prisoners to help fight these forest fires. There were prisoners who were supposed to get out, like they had served their time, but she extended their time because they needed them to fight the fires, which is a dangerous job. And another thing too is once these prisoners get out, they're not able to apply to be actual firefighters and get a job, even though they have all this experience. And there's a bunch of stuff, but one thing too about Kamala is one, she hasn't came out with any kind of policy. Uh, you know, what is her plot or platform? She hasn't said anything. There's nothing on her website, and she also hasn't given any kind of interviews or anything. It's like they're kind of just hiding her away, which makes sense because if I was running her campaign, she has everything to lose right now. So if she did do an interview and it went bad, but we don't know what she stands for. We don't know what she's running for. She's just not Trump. The question is that good enough for the American people to just not be Trump? It would be like what's your least favorite restaurant? This is kind of goofy, but what's your least favorite restaurant? I might not know what it is, but like it's something that if I gave it to you, like, oh hell no, I don't want that. Or your least favorite food, right?
Oh, that's good. So I guess I don't know. Restaurant I can't think about the top of my head. So my least favorite food was like I will say mushrooms.
Mushrooms. All right. So that would be like if I gave you like some spoiled meat or something like that. And I said, hey, here, eat this. And you were like, I don't want to eat that. That's spoiled. And I was like, well, hey, at least it's not mushrooms. That's kind of how I feel. I know it's kind of a silly analogy, but that's kind of how I feel right now. And I think how a lot of people feel right now. They're not happy about Kamala, but everybody just like, shut up. At least it's not Trump. And it's just like, is that good enough for the American people? Is that good enough to win an election? I don't know if it is. It feels like it might be 2016 all over again. People weren't crazy about Hillary. They just voted for Hillary because she wasn't Trump. You know, can this strategy, is it going to work this time when it didn't work in 2016? Who knows?
But I think one difference is that at least there was a little bit of the unknown with Trump. People could say, "Oh, maybe he will be good. We'll give him the chance." But now this time
Mm,
it's like, "Well, we know what he will do. He's
that's
made it very
true.
clear and he has that track record." Whereas before it's like people just wanted something different. But now Trump isn't that different option, right? That's not that attractive thing that's like, "Oh, maybe he can make some changes." It's like, "No, we've seen this before. We know what he will do." So that's one good thing for Kamala this time. Um, but I do also think another thing with Kamala is that at least she inspires, I think, more people to maybe get out and vote. Joe Biden wasn't very inspirational. Like
That's
people that
true.
did not like him or Trump, people were like, didn't even want to vote or they didn't have that motivation. But now with Kamala in there, maybe they have a little bit of that hope restored that like, okay, maybe she's not perfect. She's not perfect. But I also feel like you can't have a perfect candidate. I mean, the Democratic Party is not perfect. And you know, a lot of corporate Democrats and who take donor money and then they are all just doing the bidding of the people who donate to them, like the large pharmaceutical industry or whatever, right? So there is no perfect Democrat, right? So I mean, until you get money out of politics, you're never going to have that. So I think in this instance, Trump and Kamala, it's like we've seen what Trump will do, what he can do, what he's capable of, and I think he's even going to be even more unhinged in his second term than he was in his first. So at least with Kamala, it's like, yeah, she has some issues, but I think it is the better of two. And she's the better of two options. And also, people say, we have to overhaul the whole system. This two-party system isn't going to work. It's like that's great. I would love to see an overhaul of the system, but there's like 2 months before the election. We're not going to overhaul it now. So now, why don't we just vote for the safer option? In my opinion, Kamala. We'll take her to task when we have to, whenever she does policies, if we don't agree with them or if we want her to be stricter on Israel or whatever the case is, whatever the policy is. But in this instance, when it's like Trump and her, I think you have to say, like, you just have to vote for her for now. We can work on overhauling the system down the line. Like we'll do the work when we can, but we don't have time before the election to do the work.
Yeah, see, that's something they also say here. One thing when Biden was elected, people were saying, just vote for Biden. We'll push him to the left once he gets in office. Okay. So, how do we do that though, once he's in office? How do you push somebody to the left? And I know one thing you just said, you were like, well, it's going to be like this until we get money out of politics. Well, how? How do you get money out of politics? And how, you know, can we trust the Democratic Party to actually want to get money out of politics? Is that something that they want to do? And if we want to get money out of politics, I feel that's something that the people are going to have to start advocating for outside of this two political system. And how do you do that? And it's kind of like how I feel like eventually we're just kind of slowly sliding into fascism. The left kind of, or the Democratic Party kind of puts up this sort of facade of fighting back against it, but in actuality, they're a part of the problem. And people are saying just vote for Kamala. you know we'll push her to the left. Well, it just feels like 2016, not 2016, 2020 all over again. And I think a lot of people are defeated. And, it's going to be interesting. I personally, in my opinion, I think that Trump is going to win this election. I hope I'm wrong, um, but I think he's going to get back in there. And one thing we keep hearing people talk about, and I'm not sure if you've heard about this, maybe you have, but this whole Project 2025, have you heard about that? So what's your whole opinion on that?
Um, oh, I think that that's almost in and of itself is enough reason to not vote for him, or
Mm,
that I think everyone should be very concerned if he does win. I think he tried to distance himself from it. I think he put out a tweet or whatever it was saying like, "Oh, I don't even know these people," or some of the stuff in there is completely, not a part of my agenda. Some of the stuff was okay, but most of it I don't agree with, and it's outrageous, whatever, whatever. So he's tried to like distance himself from it, but I mean, we all know Trump, we all know who he is, and some of the people who are like the figureheads behind Project 2025 are people he has associated with in the past and continues to today. And also his vice president, JD Vance, is, probably on board for Project 2025. So I think that in and of itself is a disqualifying factor and almost trumps, I'm the pun, but trumps any other issue. I think Project 2025 is a terrifying view of what, and who knows, maybe it's been overblown, and maybe if he does get in, God forbid, like maybe it's not gonna like take shape the way that Project 2025 is saying it will. But I think at least with Trump, it's a lot more of a possibility than it would be with not Trump,
yeah.
right? So I think if you're worried about Project 2025, like I encourage everyone to read it. I mean, it's a huge, long document. So if you don't read it, at least go to a reputable source to like that will summarize it. But, you know, read it and then ask yourself which candidate will get us closer to Project 2025. And I think you'll see that it'll be Trump. So yeah, pretty scary stuff.
So yeah, Project 2025 is very scary. Here's the thing, right? So let's say Kamala wins, right? The people, the architects of Project 2025, they're not just going to throw their hands up in the air and be like, whoops, we lost. Oh, well, I guess we just got to go away now. They have think tanks, they have corporations, they have organizations. They've been working on this thing for a long time. And even if they lose with Trump, they're still going to work to get these ideas implemented and policies implemented. They've been doing it, for the last couple of decades. I mean, since Ronald Reagan was in office, they've been slowly implementing this. And that's one thing I feel like the right wing in this country is way more organized than the left wing is. I don't know how it is in Canada, but the right wing, they seem to be operating in lockstep. And they have a Supreme Court majority. And my question is, let's say Kamala gets in office, what is she going to do to actually fight back against this? It feels like they don't really fight back against it at all, you know? So, and that's one thing I'm like, all right, if I vote for her, what's actually going to change? These people aren't going to give up,
Oh,
but
yeah, I think in response to that, I would say because those are good questions. And it seems I agree with you. It seems like the Democrats, they don't really fight back until it's election year. And then they
yeah,
say, "Oh, we'll fight back." And then they win or they lose or whatever. But um I will just say though, like if if Kamala gets in, like she might not do stuff that will necessarily fight back against Project 2025 in like that a huge way. But if Trump wins, there will be major changes if he goes with Project 2025. Like it will not be the same America that everyone knows.
yeah,
I don't
that's
think.
true.
And that might be a very drastic opinion. Like maybe it'll be somewhere in the middle. Like maybe he won't go all the way and like enact every single thing. He might only enact a couple of things. But even if a couple of things are enacted, like that is still a huge change from the way America is today. So I think you can argue like, if Trump wins, it will be vastly different. And then if Kamala wins, it's not going to be different from what it is now, but it's going to be it's still the better alternative than, a complete like shift
That's
to
true.
the right that we'll see with Trump. Yeah.
Yeah, Kamala would maintain the status quo. The question is,
Yeah.
a lot of left wing people, a lot of people in America aren't happy with the status quo.
Yeah.
I think they said something like compared to compared to last year, if you want to live the same kind of lifestyle that you were living last year, you have to make $700 more a month, you know. And that's the thing about the economy. People are struggling. In some places, daycare is like $3,000 a month, which is, outrageous. Rent skyrocketing. A lot of people look at Trump and say, hey, the economy was better. I'm going to vote for him. I don't like him, but I'm going to vote for him because there were more jobs and I wasn't struggling. So, it's going to be a tight race. But I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about Canada, and tell you some things that I see because I'm on Reddit and I see people talking about Canada and things like that. So, what is the political climate like in Canada? Is Justin Trudeau, is he still popular? Is popularity waning? And when is your guys' next prime minister election?
Um, so to answer yet your first question, definitely not popular anymore.
Mhm.
I think I can confidently say he will lose the next election, which I think is scheduled for next year. It's next the way our elections work, it's every 4 years, but they can call an election earlier than 4 years. So if the it's just the way it worked. Like, for example, we had an election in 2019. So Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, and then we had our next one in 2019. But then we had another one in 2021, because Justin Trudeau's party, the Liberal Party, called an earlier election as like a strategic move because they wanted to get more seats in the in Parliament, in order to get more of their majority government back. So yeah, so I guess our next one I think is for 2025, like our scheduled one. Um, or no, 20. Yeah, see, that's the thing. I know more about U.S. politics because I don't even know when the next Canadian election is. That tells you how,
Yeah,
like, so, but yeah, Justin Trudeau not popular anymore. I think he's going to lose the next election whenever that is. Yeah, I voted for him in 2015. I voted for him in 2019 and even in 2021. But yeah, he's just kind of similar. I would consider him like what you would think of as like a corporate Democrat, like very just yeah, like part of the 1%, like very privileged, like rich guy. He's just all talk. I don't really take him seriously. I think that he just does a lot of fluff. And I don't really necessarily think that he is the best choice. I mean, the Conservative Party, on the other hand, is worse. So, um, but the Conservative Party is more popular in Canada right now. So if we do have an election, or when we do have an election, I do believe the Conservative Party, which I guess would be the equivalent of like the Republican Party in the States, will win. Um, so in terms of Trudeau's like policies, he's Canada policy politics in Canada, I'd say, or our policies are more left wing, I would say, obviously, than the US for sure. Like we do have a lot of like things that would be in line with like left wing or like progressive policies. But Justin Trudeau isn't really I don't consider him progressive. He's like a just a, like I said, a corporate Democrat or the equivalent of a corporate Democrat, and a lot of his promises haven't come true. I will say he dealt with COVID quite well. I did like the way he had his COVID response. But yeah, overall, I think people are just looking at the housing crisis. We have a huge housing crisis. Inflation is a huge issue. We have the opioid epidemic, the homelessness issue, which is rampant in Canada, worse than it's ever been. And Trudeau doesn't really seem too interested in doing anything to address those, or from my perspective. So yeah, I think a lot of
Yeah,
people are just, oh, go ahead.
no, I may cut you off, but one thing I see is, there's a massive amount of immigration in Canada, like legal immigration, like Indian people coming from India and coming to Canada, and they don't have enough homes for them all. And one thing I saw, it was uh you guys have a restaurant called Tim Hortons, I think what it is. It's kind of like a bakery, I think.
Oh yeah,
Um
that would be my least favorite favorite restaurant. Going back to the
yeah,
restaurant question, but
yeah,
yeah,
I
they do.
tried it. I tried it once and I was like, wow, this is bad. It's like I got a donut from there and it was really bland. I was really
Yeah,
like,
and their
yeah.
coffee is quite bad too. Yeah.
Yeah, but thinking of Tim Hortons, there was like they had a job opening, and there was like this line going down the block of people in line applying for this job. It had to be like more than 100 people in line applying for one simple customer service job. So I guess, from what I hear about what's going on in Canada, it's the jobs and the housing and the immigration. So what's your take on those three things going on right now?
Yeah, I think the immigration issue is it's an issue we have been having. Well, one of the things most recently, just over the last few months, is there's been a lot of contention, the amount of international students that we are allowing into the universities at the school and, charging them abhorrent amounts of money as an international student to come to Canada and just exploiting students who and making them pay so much and then also just giving them like subpar there's a lot of I watched an episode of I think it was The Fifth Estate, which is like a Canadian like investigative journalism sort of show, kind of like 60 Minutes. And they did an episode about, these companies in India that are like promoting coming to Canada as an international student, but promising them all of this stuff that is not even true at all. So they'll come, they'll pay way more than they thought they would pay, and then they end up in like subpar housing and just terrible. And then also we have a housing crisis anyway, so we have all these international students who are forced to live in like unfavorable conditions, and then people who are in Canada already have trouble getting housing. So it is definitely an issue, and I think we have taken in, I'm all for immigration though. Like obviously, I love when or refugees when we can like provide them refugee status and to come to Canada for a better life and all of that. But I do think like we are in such a housing crisis that like it just is an issue. We have an influx of immigrants coming in and we don't have the institutions that are able to support them in the way that we need. So the whole system as a whole is crashing. The housing prices are out of this world. Rent in Toronto is the highest it's ever been. Um, and also a lot of people will come from overseas and because they can't find housing, they'll end up in a homeless shelter or they'll end up on the street. So the number of like immigrants who come to Canada then to just end up on the street and then they're not being able to access services. Um, so we can't, it's hard for them to get into housing, hard for them to access the services that they will need, and then they end up homeless on the street. So, it's an issue, and I don't really know the answer to it. I don't know what to do to solve it because as someone who is like very pro immigration, and obviously I love and want people to come to Canada, um, you also can't deny the fact that our systems were like kind of on the brink already. And then when you have an influx of people coming from outside of Canada, it just puts even more pressure. And I don't really see what is the point at that point. We're not offering them a better life. They're ending up on the streets. They're ending up in squalor housing because there's nothing else available. So to me, I don't really understand the plan. Um, so we need to fix our institutions and actually come up with policies and plans that are going to solve the issue of housing before we are then just letting more immigrants come in to the country. But very, very complex issue. But yeah, and I think Justin Trudeau, that's why one thing he's super unpopular for. Like I think he was part of that problem. And since he's come in 2015, like he's been in the office for 9 years. That's another difference between Canada and US. Like we don't really have term limits in Canada. Like he's been prime minister for 9 years, and if he wins the next election, it could be another four. So people have seen that drastically that problem drastically increase since he's been in office. And so the conservatives are saying, if they get in, that they're going to like put a cap on that. They're going to fix the immigration issue. They're going to fix housing, whatever. So I think that attracts a lot of people to the conservative platform. Even though I think there's a lot of dangerous stuff that comes with the conservative platform. But they're going to run on that. They're going to run on those issues because that's what people in Canada right now are most concerned about, I would say.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but are you looking to reach a dynamic and engaged audience of curious minds? Well, look no further. Bright Brains Podcast is the perfect platform to showcase your business or product. You'll be able to reach a diverse and intelligent audience and engage with listeners passionate about personal development, technology, and more. Elevate your brand through thought-provoking discussions. Don't miss this opportunity to promote your business on one of the fastest growing podcasts in the market. Contact us today to discuss advertising options and elevate your brand to the next level. Contact us at brightbrainspod@gmail.com to secure your advertising spot on Bright Brains today. Again, that's Bright Brains with a Z pod pod at gmail.com. Now, back to the podcast. Yeah, so you said you've worked in homeless shelters. So tell me more about what you did in these homeless shelters and what are some things that you saw in these shelters?
Yeah. So I worked when I was a student, I worked part of my placement, my final placement was working at Seton House, which is the largest homeless shelter in Canada. Had like 600 people in the shelter. And then I went on to work at other ones in the city. But yeah, my job there was really just it was like in the harm reduction program. So it was implementing harm reduction and just maintaining the day-to-day goings on at the homeless shelter and planning activities for the residents. And we had like counselors and stuff on staff where the clients would be meeting with the counselors to either help get them housing or help them get into their appointments and all that stuff. So I was there kind of just like I wasn't a counselor or anything, but I was just like there as staff support for the day-to-day running of the program. And so the stuff that I saw, you know just it kind of goes to the housing thing, like the wait list for housing. So we would have people in the shelter who had been in the shelter for a couple of years at this point, and the point of the shelter was supposed to be a transitional period, right? It was like an emergency shelter that would provide them that shelter for that short period of time until they could get into housing. But then what happened was the wait list for housing got so long that people were waiting 2, 3, 4 years before they'd even get offered an apartment. So then it's like, well, what do they do in that interim 4 year period, 3 year period, or whatever? They would either stay in that one shelter, they'd end up on the streets again, or they'd go to another shelter, or maybe they, would get into, because the housing they were waiting for was like subsidized housing, right? So it'd be more affordable and it'd be better suited to their needs. But they could probably try and go find an apartment on their own, but then they're competing against the hundreds of people who are also looking to get into that apartment. And there's someone who is homeless, they don't have a permanent address, and they might have mental health issues, they may have addiction issues. So they're already going to be marginalized in going to get an apartment when there's 100 other people that are also wanting that apartment. So then their options are like to wait until they get into subsidized housing, but that's years. So I just saw how big of an issue the housing thing was, and then also the addiction issue, the opioid crisis. There would always be like new alerts for like fentanyl laced in the street drugs and stuff. So people in the shelter who were using drugs would sometimes overdose, or they would, know friends who overdosed or whatever because of all of the fentanyl being laced. So that got worse and worse as I was there. And I was there pre-COVID, so I can't even imagine. I actually ended up leaving just right before COVID, like a few months before COVID shut everything down. So I can't even imagine what it was like during COVID. But I can imagine obviously probably way worse. So that was it really just informed my understanding and kind of showed me how much of an issue the housing crisis and the opioid crisis was. So that was what kind of my takeaway from that experience.
Yeah. So what are the obstacles to actually building more housing?
Yeah, so the issues with building more housing is, I mean, I know from like a Toronto perspective, I think it's just like that kind of thing because rent control is like there's not really a thing like in Ontario right now or in Toronto. Any building that's from before that was built before 2018 is subject to rent control. But then any unit that's not built, that's built after 2018, basically the landlords can just increase the rent as much as they want. So then you have all of these like greedy landlords or these like condo, companies who are coming in and building all of this housing and they're going to have exorbitant rent prices and the government's really not doing a lot to like tap down the put a cap on rent, or to put rent control in place. So it's like they are building housing. Like Toronto right now is like cranes everywhere in the sky. They're building it, but I think that it just got so backlogged and there was so much demand. It's like they can't build it fast enough. So from when they start to approve the plan to build a new condo, but the time when it's open and people can move in, it's like a couple of years in between that. So it's like we almost got to the point where it's like there we had like thousands and thousands of people waiting for housing, and you can only build them so quickly. And then you have the just most of them aren't affordable, so they're going to go up and they're going to be, just as expensive as every other housing unit. I know the mayor or like Ontario is committed to, I think, a certain number of subsidized housing or affordable housing units, but still not enough for the demand, right? The majority of the people who need housing, I would say, are people who probably would require it to be subsidized. So they're just not interested or they're not building enough of those and they're not building them fast enough. So I would say. So they definitely are building it. Like I said, if you come to Toronto, you'll see all the new condos going up, but it's just a factor of how affordable are they going to be? And we needed them like yesterday. And some of
Yeah.
them are still months off, right? So
Yeah.
that's the issue.
And you mentioned also the opioid epidemic. I know here in America, the opioid epidemic is something we talk about a lot. You don't really hear much about that epidemic from the Canadian side. So what's it like up there? Is it as bad as it is down here?
Um, yeah, I would say it's pretty bad up here. I would say like per capita, it's probably similar. Like obviously US has way more higher population, so definitely have higher numbers of people impacted just because of the population. But I would say per capita, it's probably similar. I know in California, huge homelessness population, and in like Los Angeles and Skid Row and all of that. And we have the equivalent of that in Vancouver. So on our West Coast in Vancouver, we have the downtown east side, which is like a smaller scale version of what you could expect to see like on Skid Row in California in LA. Um, yeah, huge problem, huge homelessness. The opioid epidemic is really really bad. Um, I know British Columbia, so the province that Vancouver is located in, which is where the biggest opioid problem is, recently a couple years ago made like decriminalized drugs in an attempt to, tamper down on like the number of arrests and like people wouldn't be going to jail if they had up to a certain amount of drugs or whatever. Um, but yeah, just a huge problem. And the housing problem coupled with that is just a recipe for disaster. So we have a lot of like safe injection sites that kind of propped up, which was a great harm reduction strategy that I was in support of, where people could go and get clean needles or get a clean supply. They would bring their own drugs, but clean needles, and they would inject their drugs or use their drugs in like a safe, controlled environment as an attempt to be like, okay, we're not going to put you in jail, but we're going to make sure that you don't overdose because there's a lot of overdoses, right? So a lot of division in that too. A lot of people were against that, and a lot of people were for it. So recently in Ontario, they Doug Ford, who's the premier of Ontario, which I guess the premier would be like the equivalent of like the governor of a state
Hmm.
in the US. So the premier of Ontario like ordered that 10 supervised injection sites in Ontario were going to shut down. So that's been kind of controversial because a lot of people supported them and thought that they were a good thing to help with the opioid crisis and the overdose crisis. So that's kind of happening and going on right now. But yeah, overall, just a really getting worse, I would say, which is unfortunate. And I don't really know the answer. So as someone who's, worked in the shelter system and had kind of seen it up close and personal, like that definitely didn't give me the answers to how to solve this. So I'm kind of at a loss for even where to start. It's kind of so complex and probably same in the States, right? You
Yeah.
guys have the same opioid epidemics, the fentanyl crisis and all that. So I mean, what are your thoughts on it? Like, what do you think
So
about
I
the
know
issue?
there was a state here, I think it was Oregon, I want to say, where they decriminalized everything. And it was pretty much a disaster. And I think earlier this year they reversed it just because, it didn't work out the way they expected it to. I think that, yeah, they decriminalized it, but they didn't really I think one thing with the left is we're a little too optimistic. We think that there's a simple solution to everything. And what they did was they decriminalized it, but when somebody does get caught, there wasn't really any kind of repercussions for it. So I think they would like maybe get a fine or something, and they would maybe have to sit in jail for like 24 hours, but then they would just get right back out and do more drugs. And it just became a really unsafe environment. I'm curious about this whole thing about safe injection sites. What is that? Is it like a place where people just go and shoot up?
Yeah, um, so the safe injection sites, I believe the first one in North America was actually in Vancouver. It opened in 2003. So that's the oldest one. But yeah, it's basically a place that's like staffed around the clock with like nurses and like addiction workers and things like that. So it's a place where people who are drug users can come and use their drugs in a safe, controlled environment, which was a response to like the opioid crisis where a lot of them propped up because the problem was people were overdosing in a back alley somewhere and no one could find them and they would die. So this, was a solution to help save lives, right? So they could come and if their drugs were laced with fentanyl, they overdosed, they would have staff right there who could assist them and use naloxone and save them. Um, and they could also get clean needles because part of the issue or a huge part of the issue was that people were sharing needles or they were using dirty needles. So then you know, con they were contracting like Hep C or like HIV, right? Like the risk for HIV goes way up, right? If you're sharing needles and all that stuff. So the goal was to provide people clean needles to help solve that issue of like HIV transmission or Hep C transmission in the community and also to prevent overdose deaths. So that was like the goal. But I think depending on who you talk to, you probably hear different answers of how successful they were. A lot of people were against them in when they first kind of opened because people were saying, well, you're not really doing anything to deter people from using. But that wasn't really the goal because uh, from my one thing I learned from working in the shelter is I was very a proponent of harm reduction and safe injection sites because of the idea of like there's a certain percentage of the population that I think people just don't want to hear this, but there's a certain percentage of the population that will not respond well to treatment. Like some people are addicted to these drugs and they can go to treatment 5, 6, 7, 8 times and they just will relapse. It will not work. They'll go to rehab, they'll leave. Um, so there's a significant portion of the population that still need help, still need services. They still need, you know, support, even if they're not going to be free from drugs, right? So I think there was a whole abstinence thing, which is a type of harm reduction and a model that works for many people, but there's a lot of people that it doesn't work for. Some people will be using drugs for the rest of their lives. So it's kind of like, so what is the answer to that for those people? Are we going to just, you know, let them die on the streets? Or are we going to try to implement services that will help this population and help save their lives? Because at the end of the day, there's still people whose lives deserve to be saved, whether or not you think that they should be using drugs or not, right? So that was kind of the thought behind it. It's like we're serving this population, and yes, maybe they'll decide that they want to get into treatment, and if they do, that's a decision they have to make. But if they just do decide that, then we'll be able to refer them to treatment if they want it. But in the meantime, we're going to be here as a method to save their life, and so that they don't die from fentanyl overdose from their drugs. So that was the thought. So then I would say since 2016, 2017, a lot more of them started to open. Like we had a lot of them in Toronto and a lot of them in Ontario and like around Canada. But then, like I said, just like a couple of days ago, the Premier of Ontario ordered that 10 of them are going to be shut down because of complaints. Like people were complaining that they were too close to schools or they were too close to, other communities and that they were considered dangerous, right? There would be needles around on the streets or whatever, right? So
Mm,
yeah. And
yeah.
our premier is conservative, so he's anti harm reduction and he's anti drugs just in general, right? So it wasn't really surprising that he ordered that. So that's kind of the history of our safe injection sites. So right now it's kind of like a fight. People are advocating to keep them open and then others want them closed. So yeah.
Yeah. Doug Ford, I know a while back there was this politician in Canada. I don't know if it was Doug Ford or if his last name was Ford, but he was in the media a lot just for like really zany behavior. You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, you're talking about Rob Ford, and that
Rob
is
Ford.
Doug Ford's brother. So Doug
Gotcha.
Ford is his brother, yeah. So
What?
yeah. Rob Ford was the mayor of Toronto.
Mhm.
Um, and Doug Ford is now the premier, so the equivalent of like the governor of
Yeah.
Ontario, the province of Ontario, yeah.
So what happened to Rob Ford? What's he up to?
Um, so unfortunately he died of cancer
Oh,
um
I didn't know that.
in 2017, 2018 or something. Yeah. So shortly after the whole debacle with him. Yeah.
That's wild. Yeah, I remember he was like a big meme for a while. Like, he also had a drug problem too, didn't he? Like he said he had smoked crack
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh man.
There's like videos of him smoking crack. And that's
Videos?
why
Oh wow.
yeah. There would be like videos that leaked of like him smoking crack, people filming him and then they leaked it to the press. So that's why it's kind of ironic to me that now his brother is like so anti-drugs
Yeah.
when his brother was addicted
Well,
to.
he probably saw what happened to his brother, you know. That's crazy,
Yeah,
man.
yeah.
All right, man. Hey, this has been a great discussion, man. I really learned a lot, and it's always good to connect with people from other countries. And hopefully, both of our countries manage to get it together and fix the problems we face. Before I go, you have anything to promote?
Um, I mean, I have a podcast of my own actually, not politics related, so it's like separate, but yeah, it's my two sisters and I, we host a true crime podcast. So it's called Crime Family. So if anyone wants to take a listen, we're on all the platforms. So just look up Crime Family and we'll come up. And yeah, if you're a fan of true crime, you can come and listen to our show. And yeah,
All right, I'll definitely check it out. One last question: What do you think is probably the most interesting true crime case that you've covered?
that's a good question. I would say the most interesting or the one that kind of sticks out to me the most um was back like early. We've been doing the podcast for about 3 years. So this was one that we did early on. It's the Adnan Syed case. So if anyone listens to the Serial podcast, which was like a pretty famous true crime podcast, it was about that case. So just about a missing high school student who was murdered, and her ex-boyfriend was put in jail for like 20 years and just recently got released because he didn't do it.
Oh
Um,
wow.
so that I definitely encourage, if anyone's a fan of true crime or likes to listen to true crime, to look up the Adnan Syed case because it's crazy.
Awesome. I'll check it out then. All right, man. Thanks a lot. You take care.
Thank you. This was great chatting with you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, it was fun.
Awesome. See you later, man. All right. That's a wrap. Thank you for joining us for another enlightening conversation here on Bright Brains. I hope you've gained valuable insights and inspiration to fuel your own bright ideas. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform or however else you listen to this podcast. Also, we can be found on all major social media. Just type in Bright Brains with a Z. And remember, the brightest minds are those that never stop seeking knowledge.